They invited me on a trip, called it a family vacation. But I came home not with them, but with a plan that would forever close their access to my $24 million. I should have recognized the warning signs the moment Greg called. My son doesn't usually pick up the phone unless there's a birthday to remember, a bill to discuss, or some small crisis to manage. But that evening his voice was warm, almost sticky sweet, like maple syrup on a cold plate. "Mom," he said. "Meline and I were just talking. You have to come with us to Florida this year. It's been too long. We want some real family bonding time. Wouldn't feel right without you. It's been a long time since anyone told me my presence would make something feel right." Needed? Yes, I've been needed plenty. For babysitting, for a loan. For the kind of steadying voice you give when someone's life is falling apart. But wanted? Not for years. And so I let myself believe him. I packed light. Just my sundresses, a cardigan for evenings, the wide-brimmed straw hat Frank bought me the summer before he passed. I even tucked my checkbook into the side pocket of my bag, just in case, though I told myself I wouldn't be silly enough to use it much. From the start, though, the trip wasn't the dream they painted. The first morning after we landed, Greg forgot his wallet in the hotel safe. Meline's purse, she explained, was too small for cash. So I paid for breakfast. Later that day, when we were at the theme park gates, Greg patted his pockets with a sheepish grin. "Mom, you wouldn't mind covering the tickets, would you? I'll get you back." I knew better than to expect repayment, but I said yes anyway. By the third day, my magic plastic card had handled every park pass, boat ride, and hotel dinner. I even covered the silly dolphin keychains Meline picked out for the kids, but ended up dangling from her own tote. Greg made a joke one night over dinner, grinning at the waiter as he slid my card across the table. "Good thing Mom brought her magic wallet." He laughed like it was charming. I smiled along, but something sour started curling in my stomach. It wasn't just the money. It was the remarks. Meline rolled her eyes whenever I asked to slow down because my knees were aching. "You really have to get with the times," she told me at lunch one day when I ordered hot tea instead of some pink drink in a mason jar. Greg sighed whenever I took too long in a gift shop. More than once I caught them exchanging glances over my head, the way people do when they think the person they're talking about can't see. By the last day, I was more tired than I'd been in years, not just from the walking and the heat, but from the weight of feeling like a burden they were tolerating. We loaded into the rental car for the long drive home, the kids playing on their tablets in the back seat, Meline tapping away on her phone. A couple of hours in, Greg pulled into a gas station. "Stretch your legs, Mom," he said, too brightly. "We'll fill up and grab some snacks." The sun was warm on my shoulders as I stepped out. My back was stiff, so I took my time walking toward the restroom. Inside, I splashed a little cool water on my face, straightened my cardigan, and tried to remind myself that the worst was behind me. Just a few more hours and I'd be back home. When I came back out, the car was gone. I stood there for a moment, scanning the lot. Maybe they'd pulled around to the other side. I walked to the corner of the building, but there was nothing. Just a couple of pickup trucks and a dusty sedan. I went back to the pump where they'd been parked, certain they'd be back in a minute. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The shadow of the pump stretched longer across the pavement. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. An hour later it sank in. They weren't coming back. I sat down on the curb, my hands folded tight in my lap, my mind refusing to shape the words. My son just left me here. Two young men walked out of the convenience store laughing. As they passed, one nudged the other. "Hey, isn't that the lady those two ditched earlier?" "Yeah," the other replied, smirking. They peeled out of here laughing like it was the best joke of the trip. The heat rushed to my face, hotter than the Florida sun. I'd half hoped there'd been some emergency, some misunderstanding. But no, it had been planned. The shame was sharp and clean, like stepping barefoot on glass. I didn't cry, not then. I walked inside, bought myself a small coffee, and found a seat in the corner of the little cafe attached to the station. And while I sat there, the paper cup warm between my palms, one thing became clear. I was not going to be the helpless old woman they thought I was. That first night at the gas station, I didn't bother finding a motel. I sat at a corner table in the little cafe until the waitress, a girl with bright pink hair and a name tag that read Shay, gently told me they were closing. She didn't rush me, just slid my coffee mug toward me one last time and said, "You okay, ma'am?" I smiled, the kind of small, tight smile you give when the truth would be too heavy for someone else to carry. "I will be," I told her. And I meant it, though I wasn't sure how. Outside, the air was thick with that coastal humidity that sticks to your skin. I tucked myself into a corner of the covered seating area and wrapped my cardigan around me. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Greg's taillights fading into the distance. Morning came gray and slow. I went back inside, ordered the cheapest breakfast on the menu, and sat by the window watching the pumps. People came and went, some in a hurry, some stretching their legs like I'd done the day before. And then I saw it, taped to the inside of the cafe's glass door, just beside the rack of tourist brochures, a piece of printer paper with bold black letters. "Help wanted, immediate start." I stared at it while I finished my coffee. I didn't have luggage beyond my handbag. My phone was fully charged. My pride was bruised, but my legs still worked. And here was a way to stay on my feet and in control until I figured out my next move. I asked to speak to the manager. She turned out to be a brisk woman named Carla, with laugh lines around her eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. "You got cafe experience?" she asked, flipping through a stack of papers behind the counter. "I've been feeding people for nearly 70 years, I said. "Does that count?" Carla chuckled. "Can you pour coffee without spilling, wipe down tables, and keep the pie case stocked?" "I can do that in my sleep," I replied. And just like that, I was hired, not for a glamorous position, but for one that paid cash at the end of each day and came with a staff meal. I tied on an apron and got to work. The hours blurred. I refilled mugs, cleared plates, and learned that Shay had 2 kids at home and a boyfriend who built shrimp boats. I learned that Carla had once driven cross-country on a motorcycle. And I learned something about myself. I was a lot stronger than the picture my son had painted in his mind. By the end of the 3rd day, I'd earned enough for a bus ticket halfway home, and a little extra. But the thought of heading straight back, tail between my legs, didn't sit right. I wanted time to think. Time to figure out what this whole rotten experience meant, and what I was going to do with the rest of my life. On my 4th day at the cafe, a retired truck driver came in for lunch. His name was Walt, a wiry man with a weathered face and the kind of calm that comes from years of long, quiet highways. He ordered a BLT and coffee, and when I brought it to him, he looked me over like he could tell I wasn't from around there. "You stuck or traveling?" he asked. I laughed, though it came out more like a sigh. "A little of both." He didn't pry, just nodded and said, "I'm headed north tomorrow. Could take you partway, if you don't mind truck stops and bad country radio." I thanked him and said I'd think about it. That night, after my shift, I sat at one of the empty tables with a pad of paper and started writing down what I had, and what I didn't. I had a ride halfway home if I wanted it, enough money for the rest of the bus fare, my phone, my ID, and my bank account intact. The hard proof that my son's idea of family bonding was really use mom until she's inconvenient. What I didn't have, any interest in returning to my life exactly as it had been before. Because the truth was, Greg had been treating me like a burden for a long time. This gas station stunt wasn't an isolated moment. It was just the most obvious one. I thought of all the little requests over the years, all the times my generosity had been treated as obligation. I realized something that night, staring at my list. I didn't have to keep playing that role. I was free to change the script. The next morning, I accepted Walt's offer. We rode in silence for the first hour, the hum of the road steady under us. Then, somewhere between counties, he told me his own story. How his kids had stopped calling after his wife died. How the house he'd built with his own hands now sat empty because he couldn't bear the quiet. You reach a point, he said, where you stop waiting for folks to do right by you. You just do right by yourself. Those words stuck to me like burrs. By the time Walt dropped me at the bus station in Savannah, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't just going home. I was going to change the rules of the game entirely. When the bus finally rolled into my town, it was just past noon. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint tang of the river. I stepped down slowly, my knees stiff from the ride, my cardigan folded neatly over my arm. I could have taken a cab, but the walk from the station to my house was short, and I needed to feel the ground under my feet again. By the time I reached my street, I'd passed the bakery with the same pink awning it's had since the 1970s, the hardware store where Frank used to buy nails by the pound, and Mrs. Kramer's place, still with that peeling white fence. Home hadn't changed, but I had. My porch looked just as I'd left it. The 2 wicker chairs with faded cushions, the fern in the corner that had survived 3 summers longer than I expected, the welcome mat that had been turned sideways in my absence. I set my bag down, took the spare key from under the 3rd brick, and stepped inside. The first thing I did was put the kettle on. I didn't even take my shoes off. I just stood in my own kitchen, letting the click and hum of the stove settle into my bones. I pulled out my favorite mug, the one with the little chip in the handle, and the good tin of Darjeeling. The first sip was a bomb. That's when it really hit me. I was back, but nothing would be the same. Not because of the trip, but because of what it showed me. My son didn't see me as a mother anymore. I was a resource, a wallet with legs. And when I was no longer convenient, he'd proved how easy it was to shut the car door and drive away. I carried my tea into the sitting room and sat in my armchair. Across from me was the low bookshelf where I kept my address book. I pulled it out and flipped through the pages until I found her name. Margaret Carter. Margaret and I had known each other since we were 8 years old. 2 girls in pigtails playing jacks on the school steps. We'd been there for each other's milestones. Her wedding, my first baby, her divorce, my Frank's funeral. She'd gone on to law school while I stayed in town, raising kids and keeping house. Now she was one of the most respected estate lawyers in the county, and still one of my truest friends. I dialed her number. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice as brisk and warm as ever. Well, if it isn't the long-lost wanderer. I saw a postcard from Florida on your Facebook. Did you have a good trip? I almost laughed. That depends on your definition of good, I said. Do you have a pot of coffee on? I need to tell you a story. Half an hour later, I was sitting at her kitchen table, my tea replaced by a mug of her strong black coffee. Margaret listened without interrupting as I told her everything. The so-called bonding trip, the steady drip of expenses I'd been nudged into covering, the little digs about my old-fashioned ways, and finally the gas station. When I got to the part about the 2 travelers confirming it was planned, Margaret's mouth tightened into a thin line. Well, she said, you've always been generous. Maybe too generous. But this is calculated cruelty. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. So what do? I can't exactly teach my son manners at his age. And I won't spend the rest of my days wondering when the next shove is coming. Margaret tapped her nails against her coffee mug, thinking. Tell me, are you still in full control of your accounts? Yes, I said. Every penny. Her eyes lit with that sharp intelligence I'd seen 100 times before. Then maybe it's time to stop letting them treat you like a bank. If you're tired of everyone assuming your money is theirs for the taking, you can lock the vault. I frowned. Lock it how? She smiled, the slow, deliberate smile of a lawyer who knows she's about to shift the ground under someone's feet. By moving it somewhere they can't touch it. Somewhere it'll do good for people who actually appreciate it. The thought took root faster than I expected. I'd inherited a considerable sum from my parents, and over the years, careful investments had turned it into something even larger. It was meant to be a safety net for my old age, but I'd been told more than once, by Greg especially, that it would all go to the kids eventually. What if, Margaret continued, you put it into a charitable foundation under your sole direction? Scholarships, shelters, grants, whatever you care about most. You could still live comfortably, but they wouldn't have access. Not now. Not ever. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. Control. We sat for another hour, mapping out the broad strokes. Margaret explained the process, the paperwork, the timing. We'd do it quietly with no fanfare. And when it was done, I could decide exactly who and what I wanted to help. By the time I walked back to my house, the afternoon sun was dipping low, spilling gold across my porch. I stood there for a moment, tea mug in hand, and thought about Greg's face when he realized the money he'd been counting on was gone. Not out of spite, no, I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it to keep my life, my choices, and my resources in my own hands. The kettle inside began to whistle again, and I went in, ready to take the first real step toward my new plan. Once Margaret and I agreed on the plan, we didn't waste any time. The very next morning, she came by my house with a slim leather portfolio and a thermos of coffee. We're going to treat this like a heist, she said, setting her bag on my dining table. Only difference is you're stealing from yourself and giving it to a better cause. We started with my accounts, all of them. Checking, savings, CDs, investments I'd had for decades. Margaret had me print every statement and go over them line by line. We leave nothing for anyone to question later, she said. Her pen scratched across the margins, marking balances and interest rates. I kept thinking how Greg wouldn't even know how to read half these numbers, let alone understand what they meant. By lunchtime, the portfolio was stuffed with neatly organized papers, color-coded tabs sticking out like little flags. Margaret pushed her chair back and rubbed her hands together. All right. Next step, the foundation. She explained it in simple terms. I'd form a charitable foundation under my sole control. I would be the director, the only one with the legal authority to decide where the money went. No one, not your son, not your daughter-in-law, not even a distant cousin with a sob story, can touch this without your say-so. We spent that afternoon filling in forms with names that felt like more than just paperwork. They were promises. The scholarship fund for underprivileged kids would be called the Clara Foundation for Education. The shelter program for women leaving abusive homes would be named Safe Haven Homes, in honor of my mother. And the small arts grant in my hometown would simply be the Maple Street Fund, for the street where I grew up, back when neighbors knew each other's names. Margaret made sure everything was airtight. It's not enough to move the money, she warned. You have to show you acted with clear intent. No one should be able to claim you were pressured or confused. We set appointments with the bank managers, quiet, private meetings behind closed doors. Each time I dressed in my best. Pressed slacks, pearl earrings, my hair set just so. I wanted anyone watching to see a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. One banker, a young man who couldn't have been more than 30, tried to hide his surprise at the size of my transfers. That's quite a sum, Mrs. Whitaker, he said, glancing at the figures. Are you sure you want to move all this? I met his gaze and said, I'm not moving it. I'm directing it. He smiled politely, but I could tell he'd remember those words. Good. In between the official work, Margaret and I had tea at my kitchen table and planned the announcement, or rather, the lack of one. If they find out before we're ready, they'll cause trouble, she said, meaning Greg and Meline, though she didn't name them. So we say nothing until every last document is signed, sealed, and filed. The days passed in a kind of quiet thrill. Every signature, every stamped form felt like another brick in the wall between my money and their entitled hands. I slept better than I had in months, One evening, as we were reviewing the last of the paperwork, Margaret paused and looked at me. "Are you sure, Clara? This is the point of no return. Once this is in the foundation, there's no taking it back for anyone." I thought about the gas station, about the way Greg's laughter had faded into the distance, about all the times I'd been expected to pay without thanks, give without being asked, and disappear when I was no longer convenient. "I've never been more sure," I said. The final signing took place in Margaret's office. It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels like it could cut glass. I wore my navy wool coat and the brooch Frank had given me on our 20th anniversary. The secretary brought in a stack of documents, and I signed them one by one. The pen was heavy in my hand but steady. When the last signature was done, Margaret gathered the papers, tapped them into a neat pile, and slid them into a thick envelope. "It's done," she said softly. "You've just moved $24 million into a foundation that will outlive you. And you've shut the door on anyone who thought they had a claim to it." I exhaled slowly. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. We didn't celebrate with champagne or anything flashy. We went back to my house, made grilled cheese sandwiches, and ate them on the porch while the sun dipped low over the trees. "They'll find out eventually," Margaret said, sipping her coffee. "Oh, I know," I replied. "And when they do, I'll have the truth ready for them, every last bit of it." Because that was the next part of the plan. Not just to protect what was mine, but to show in black and white exactly why I'd done it. For now, though, I let myself enjoy the quiet. The money was safe. My choices were my own. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't living under someone else's thumb. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I had just set a fresh pot of tea on the stove and was rolling out dough for oatmeal cookies when the front door banged open so hard it rattled the glass in the frame. Greg's voice came barreling down the hall before I even saw him. "Mom, what the hell is this?" I didn't hurry. The dough still needed folding, and whatever this was, I could guess it had to do with the calls I'd been expecting ever since Margaret filed the last of the foundation paperwork. Greg appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed, hair mussed, a folded sheet of paper clutched in one fist. Meline was right behind him, arms crossed like she was bracing for a courtroom showdown. I dusted my hands on a towel and walked into the living room. "Well, hello to you too," I said. "What brings you storming in like a pair of debt collectors?" Greg shook the paper at me. "We just got a call from the bank. They said you moved every cent out of your accounts into some foundation you control. You didn't tell us. You didn't even ask." Meline jumped in before I could reply. "We've been planning around that money for years, Clara. Families don't do this to each other." I raised an eyebrow. "Planning around money that was never yours? Interesting way to define family." Greg scowled. "We're your children. That money was supposed to come to us someday. That's how these things work." "Someday," I said evenly, "isn't the same as today. And even then, supposed to only exists if I say so." Meline gave a little laugh, not the kind that comes from humor, but the kind meant to belittle. "This is emotional. You're overreacting to one misunderstanding on a trip." My gaze stayed steady. "You mean the trip where you let me pay for nearly everything, called me old-fashioned every time I slowed down, and then left me at a gas station on the side of the highway? That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a choice." Greg's shoulders stiffened. "We thought you'd catch up." "No," I said, cutting him off. "You thought I'd quietly accept whatever you did, the way I have too many times before. You miscalculated." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Greg looked anywhere but at me, and Meline's jaw clenched. Finally, Greg dropped onto the couch, the paper still in his hand. "You can't just decide to cut us out like this. That's not right." "It's not legal you're wondering about," I said. "Because it is. My lawyer made sure of that. What you mean is it's not convenient. And you're right, it isn't. Not for you." Greg's voice softened, trying a different tactic. Mom, you're making a mistake. We're family. We've been counting on. I held up a hand. There's the truth. You've been counting on something that was never promised. And you treated me like an obligation to manage, not a mother to cherish. You made your choices. I'm making mine. Meline uncrossed her arms just long enough to gesture toward the paper. So you'd rather give all of it to strangers than your own son? I'd rather give it to people who won't use me and then throw me away, I said simply. Silence filled the room. The mantel clock ticked, and somewhere outside a car door shut. I let the quiet stretch until Greg looked down at the paper in his hands. This isn't fair, he muttered. Fair, I said, would have been not leaving your mother behind like she was excess luggage. Fair would have been paying your share on that trip, or even asking how I was doing instead of treating me like a walking credit card. You want fair? This is me making things fair for me. Greg leaned back, exhaling through his nose like he was trying to keep his temper in check. Meline looked at him, then at me, her lips pressed tight. I could see the wheels turning, not toward understanding but toward whatever their next move might be. I stood, smoothed my apron, and walked to the kitchen. The tea had steeped enough. I poured it into 3 cups, set them on a tray, and brought them back. I placed the tray on the coffee table between us, the steam curling into the air. Greg frowned, confused by my calm. Meline didn't reach for her cup. I settled back into my armchair, folded my hands, and looked at them both. I don't raise my voice, I just serve them tea and tell them to sit down. They didn't touch their tea at first. Greg sat with his shoulders hunched forward, his eyes darting between the cup and me, like he wasn't sure if this was some kind of trap. Meline perched on the edge of the couch, hands folded neatly over her knee. Her gaze fixed on a spot just past my shoulder as though I weren't quite worth looking at directly. I reached down to the little side table beside my armchair and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. I set it on the coffee table with a solid thump. The sound made Greg flinch. What's that? He asked. Everything, I said, flipping the cover open. Since you've both made it clear you think my decision was rash and emotional, I thought it was only fair to show you how very reasonable it actually was. On top was a neat stack of receipts, hotel bills, restaurant charges, theme park passes, all from our so-called family getaway. I slid them toward Greg. Every single expense I covered on that trip. You'll notice it includes all the extras, souvenirs, overpriced snacks, that VIP dolphin encounter Meline wanted. Meline's jaw tightened. We would have paid you back. I met her eyes. You've been saying that for years, dear. Hasn't happened yet. Beneath the receipts was a small USB stick in a clear plastic envelope. This, I said, is the gas station security footage. Shows me standing outside with my bag waiting. Shows you driving off without me. Shows you laughing. Greg's face went pale. You got the footage? The cafe owner was kind enough to help, I said. He also wrote this. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, the ink crisp and black. A statement saying I was stranded there for hours until I asked if they had a room for rent. He let me sleep in the break room until I found work. Meline gave a short, incredulous laugh. Work? At a gas station cafe? Yes, I said simply. Because unlike some people, I don't believe I'm above doing what needs to be done. That's how I earned the money to get home. And that's how I met people who reminded me that family is chosen as much as it's given. Greg picked up one of the receipts and stared at it like he was trying to find a flaw in my math. You've been keeping all this? For years, I said. Not because I wanted to use it against you, but because I knew this day would come. I knew there'd be a time when you'd stand here and act like I'd wronged you, and I wanted the truth in black and white. I turned the folder toward them again, flipping to the last section, a printout of the foundation charter. The pages were clean, official, stamped and signed. Here, I said, tapping the header. This is the Clara Foundation. Every penny of my $24 million is now under its care. I decide where it goes. Scholarships for kids who can't afford college. Shelters for women who have nowhere else to go. Grants for the arts in my hometown. All things I value. All things I know will make a difference. Greg's voice rose. You're giving it away to strangers. I shook my head. I'm giving it away to people who need it. People who won't treat me like a resource to drain. People who won't abandon me at a gas station because I walk too slow or ask for a proper cup of tea. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking. Meline shifted in her seat, glancing at Greg, but neither of them spoke. You see, I went on, my tone steady. This isn't revenge. It's self-preservation. I've spent my whole life caring for people, often at my own expense. But I won't spend my last years waiting for the next time my own son decides I'm a burden. This way I take care of myself and I take care of others who will appreciate it. Greg finally set the receipts down. His voice was quieter now, but still edged. So that's it? We're just cut off? You're adults, I said. You make your own way. Just as I've always had to. I closed the folder and slid it back to my side of the table. I've shown you the facts. You can be angry if you want, but don't you dare say this was done without thought. I've thought about it for a long time, longer than you realize. Greg didn't respond. Meline stood first, smoothing her skirt. We'll see about this, she said, her tone clipped. I simply sipped my tea. You do that. And as they left, the folder sat on the table beside me, its weight a quiet reminder that I had the truth on my side. And that was more than enough. It didn't take long after they stormed out for the papers to arrive. A man in a rumpled suit came to my door one morning, holding a thin envelope with my name typed neatly across the front. He looked embarrassed, like he wished he could hand it to anyone else. Sorry, ma'am, he said. Just doing my job. I thanked him, took the envelope, and read it at my kitchen table while the kettle boiled. The words petition for financial relief stared up at me in bold black print. Greg and Meline were suing me, claiming I'd acted under emotional distress and undue influence from my lawyer friend Margaret, and that I had a moral obligation to preserve their inheritance. I laughed, but it wasn't from humor. It was the sort of laugh you give when you're too tired to be surprised anymore. Then I picked up the phone and called Margaret. They're really doing it? She asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and the faintest touch of glee. Oh, they're doing it, I said. What's our next step? Margaret laid it out plain. We'd respond in writing, gather every piece of documentation we'd already prepared, and walk into that courtroom ready for whatever performance they had planned. And Clara, she added, don't let them rattle you. The calmer you are, the more their theatrics will stand out. The day of the hearing dawned cold and clear. I wore my navy coat, the same one I'd worn when signing the foundation papers, and the brooch Frank had given me all those years ago. Margaret met me at the courthouse steps, her briefcase in one hand, her other hand resting lightly on my arm. Inside, the room smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper. Greg and Meline were already there, seated at the petitioner's table. Meline wore a tailored suit and a look of quiet satisfaction, while Greg kept his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, flipping through them like he was the one with evidence to show. The judge, a tall man with a silver beard and a voice like gravel, called us to order. Greg's lawyer, a young fellow with a too-tight tie, stood first. Your Honor, this case is about family duty. Mrs. Whitaker has been unduly influenced to make drastic financial decisions that harm her immediate family. We intend to show that her actions were not only rash but made without full understanding of the consequences. I could almost see Margaret smiling without moving her lips. She let him finish, then rose with a calm that could steady a ship in a storm. Your Honor, she began, this case is not about family duty. It is about respect, or more accurately, the lack thereof. We will show that my client acted with full understanding, over a long period of consideration, and with evidence to justify her decisions. We will also show that the petitioner's own conduct directly led to the outcome they now contest. The judge motioned for them to proceed. Greg's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a confused old woman led astray by a meddling friend. Melline nodded solemnly at every sentence, like she was performing grief in slow motion. Greg spoke about the shock of learning the money was gone, about how it had always been understood that he'd inherit it. When it was our turn, Margaret stood and laid the folder on the table before the judge. She handed over the receipts, the security footage, the cafe owner's statement. Every piece of the story, documented and orderly. She explained the process of creating the foundation, the safeguards I put in place, the months of deliberate action. Then the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "can you tell the court in your own words why you moved your assets in this way?" I stood, smoothed my skirt, and looked him straight in the eye. Because I was tired of being treated like a wallet instead of a person. Because my own son invited me on a trip where I was expected to pay for nearly everything, then left me at a gas station on the way home. Because I decided I'd rather use my money to help people who appreciate it than to bankroll those who see me as a burden. And because it's mine to direct, Your Honor. I've earned the right to choose. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Greg shifted in his seat. Melline's lips tightened. The judge nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll hear closing arguments tomorrow." As we left the courthouse, Margaret leaned close and whispered, "You just won this case, Clara. They just don't know it yet." And I believed her. The next morning, the courthouse steps gleamed wet from an early drizzle, and the air smelled of damp concrete. Margaret and I arrived early, just as we had the day before. She walked with that same steady stride, her briefcase swinging at her side, her head high. I followed her lead. Inside, Greg and Melline were already seated. Greg was tapping his fingers on the table, a quick, agitated rhythm. Melline's hair was pulled back tighter than I'd ever seen it. Her eyes narrowed at some invisible point on the floor. The judge entered, the clerk called us to order, and the room fell into that special kind of hush only courtrooms seem to have. "I've reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented," the judge began, his voice gravelly but clear. "This case hinges on one question. Did Mrs. Whitaker have the right and capacity to transfer her assets as she saw fit?" Greg straightened in his chair, as if he thought the judge might be about to side with him. I didn't move. The judge continued. "The answer, based on the facts, is yes. Mrs. Whitaker's actions were deliberate, well documented, and made without coercion. The petitioner's claim of undue influence is unsupported. Furthermore, the court finds no legal obligation for Mrs. Whitaker to preserve her assets for the benefit of her adult children." I heard Margaret's quiet inhale beside me, but she didn't speak. The judge looked directly at Greg and Melline. "Your feelings on the matter are understandable, but feelings are not the law. Petition denied. Case dismissed." He gave the gavel a single decisive tap. And just like that, it was over. Greg's head dropped forward, and for a moment I thought he might finally understand, that he'd see this for the turning point it was. But when he lifted his face, it wasn't remorse I saw. It was disbelief. Pure, stubborn disbelief that his plan hadn't worked. Melline leaned in, whispering something in his ear. Whatever it was made his jaw tighten, and he shook his head. Margaret was already gathering our papers. "Well," she said softly, "that's that." I stood, smoothed my skirt, and turned toward the aisle. Greg didn't look at me. Neither did Melline. I walked right past them, my steps slow and steady, my hands light at my sides. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. Margaret and I paused at the top of the courthouse steps. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Lighter," I said. Like I just set down a bag I'd been carrying for years. She smiled, that knowing smile she'd had since we were girls. You handled yourself perfectly in there, Clara. Calm, clear, and unshakable. That's because I knew the truth was on my side, I said. And now so does the court. We walked to her car in companionable silence. I could feel something in me settling. Not a triumphant feeling exactly, but a quiet certainty. The matter was closed. My money was secure, my choices intact. That night, back in my own kitchen, I made a pot of tea and set a single place at the table. I thought of how Greg had looked. Not like a son who'd lost a case, but like a man whose entire sense of entitlement had been cracked in two. And I thought of Meline, so sure she could play the part of the wronged daughter-in-law, only to find the judge unmoved. I didn't gloat. That's not my way. But I did let myself enjoy the peace. I opened the folder one last time, ran my fingers over the neatly stacked papers, and then closed it for good. It went back on the shelf where it belonged. Not to be touched again unless someone came asking questions they didn't really want answered. When I went to bed, I slept soundly. No knots in my stomach. No restless thoughts about what they might try next. Because whatever came, I knew I had already won the only battle that mattered. The right to live my life without being someone else's plan for their future. The morning after the verdict, I woke to sunlight spilling across my bedroom floor. It was quiet. No phone ringing, no demands, no one sighing in the hallway because I was taking too long. Just the sound of birds outside and the faint ticking of the clock on my dresser. I stayed in bed a little longer than usual, not out of weariness but because I could. The case was behind me. Greg and Meline couldn't touch my life or my money anymore. That thought was as warming as the sunlight on my quilt. When I finally got up, I walked through the house with a new set of eyes. The furniture was the same, the pictures on the walls the same, but it felt lighter. As if some unseen weight had been lifted out through the front door with them. I decided it was time to reclaim the space in a more tangible way. The dining room was my first target. That heavy oak table, which had been crammed with extra leaves for family dinners that never happened, took up far too much room. I removed the leaves, shrinking it back to a cozy size for 2 or 3 people. The room instantly felt airier. Then I moved to the walls. The photos from the past few years, stiff, awkward snapshots from birthdays or holidays where everyone was more interested in their phones than each other, came down. In their place, I hung older photographs. Me and Frank on our first road trip, a picture of my parents in their Sunday best, a black and white shot of me and Margaret at the county fair when we were 17. By the time I finished, the house no longer whispered about obligations and expectations. It told my story again. That afternoon, I brewed a fresh pot of tea and called a few old friends I hadn't had over in years. Come by tomorrow, I told them. I'll make something sweet. We'll sit and talk like we used to. They came, 3 of them, bearing flowers and chatter. We sat in the living room with the windows open, letting in the late spring breeze. We laughed until our cheeks hurt, swapping stories about school days, old neighbors, and the silly things our children had done, and in some cases were still doing. It struck me mid-laughter that it had been years since I'd hosted people who were here just to enjoy my company, not to size up what they might get from me. The air felt clearer somehow, as though the house itself had been waiting for this kind of joy to come back in. In the days that followed, I allowed myself small indulgences. A day trip to the botanical gardens, where I wandered slowly among the roses with no one hurrying me along. Lunch at the little cafe downtown, where the waitress knew my name and asked after my garden. A walk in the park each Sunday, stopping at my favorite bench under the maple tree to read a chapter or 2 from whatever book I had in my bag. I stopped checking my phone for calls from Greg. They didn't come anyway. Margaret told me now and then that she'd heard little murmurs, second-hand comments from people who knew them, but I let it pass. I had no interest in keeping score. My life had shifted onto a different track, one where their approval or disapproval didn't matter a lick. One evening I sat out on my porch with a cup of chamomile tea, listening to the crickets. The foundation was already in motion, funding the first round of scholarships and preparing grant applications for the shelter program. I thought of those young students who'd get a chance they might never have had otherwise, of the women who'd find a safe bed for the night, of the art that would bloom in my hometown because someone believed in it. That was where my money belonged, in lives that could be lifted, not in bankrolling ungrateful demands. The porch light hummed faintly above me, and I leaned back in my chair, the air warm against my skin. The house behind me was quiet, peaceful, truly mine again. And for the first time in years, I felt I was living exactly as I wanted to, no burdens, no strings, just the comfort of my own choosing. The weeks after the court case seemed to roll by at an easy pace, each day unfolding without the shadow of someone else's expectations hanging over me. The air in my home stayed light, the quiet warm instead of lonely. I found myself smiling more, not for anyone else's benefit but simply because I could. The foundation took on a life of its own. Margaret, ever the steady hand, guided me through the first board meetings, though I remained the sole decision-maker. The first round of scholarships went out to 6 bright-eyed young people who, in their thank you letters, wrote about dreams of becoming teachers, engineers, and nurses. I read each letter twice, sometimes 3 times, my tea growing cold beside me. The shelter program began modestly. A rented house with 4 bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled of fresh bread thanks to a volunteer who baked every Thursday. I visited one afternoon bringing along a box of books and some quilts I'd made years ago. One woman, barely in her 20s, hugged me like I'd given her the moon. The arts grant in my hometown sparked a revival I hadn't dared hope for. A small theater that had been shuttered for years reopened for community plays. On its first night, I drove down and sat in the 3rd row, watching local actors perform a light-hearted comedy. When the curtain fell, the applause was loud enough to make the old rafters tremble. My days were full but never rushed. I baked when the mood struck, sometimes leaving extra loaves or pies on neighbors' porches. Friends came by for tea, bringing their laughter with them. I spent more time on my porch watching the seasons shift, the first blush of summer flowers, the gentle drift of autumn leaves. Every now and then, I drove past that same gas station where Greg and Meline had left me. The pumps gleamed in the sun, the little cafe still had its handwritten special of the day, board propped outside. I never went in. I didn't need to. Just seeing it reminded me how far I'd come. Not in miles but in self-respect. Greg never did apologize, not properly. We spoke once or twice after the case, the conversations polite but clipped. I didn't press. I'd stopped expecting him to be someone he wasn't. Meline didn't call at all, which suited me fine. One evening as I sat with Margaret on the porch, she said, "You know, Clara, you've built yourself quite a good life here." I looked out at the yard, the late sun turning everything gold. "I suppose I have," I said. "And it all started the day they left me behind. Funny, isn't it?" Margaret chuckled. Funny in that way life sometimes is. The hard moments turn into the best beginnings. I thought about that long after she'd gone home. I'd once believed security came from making sure everyone else was taken care of first. But now I knew real security came from knowing I could take care of myself, and from choosing to share only with those who treated that gift with gratitude. The foundation was growing, the house was warm, and my heart was steady. There were no more burdens I didn't choose to carry. I was, in every sense of the word, happily unburdened.